Overcoming limits is an obsession for us Westerners. This obsession with surpassing limits is matched only by a mirror obsession. Fear of the ultimate limit, our own death, with large undeserved consequences. My new book, Limits, Why Malthus Was Wrong, Why Environmentalism Is There, I argue that natural limits and limitless growth are two sides of the same coin. The specter of limits drives the pursuit of growth. The pursuit of growth without limits is planetary breakdown. Environmentalists like myself have been trapped within this logic. We perceive the planet as limited the moment we were shooting out of its limit.
Hello, sorry, I think there is no sound in the video or very, very low.
This thinking owes a lot to a little.
Yeah, same thing here. We cannot hear the video.
Malthus's essay on population. Malthus is remembered today as the prophet of limits and doom. But Malthus, I show in my book, was as much an apostle of limitless growth. Assuming that unlimited population growth is God-given and desirable, Malthus concluded that we could never have enough food for everyone. The only response he saw was to grow more food. Like Malthus, economists today assume humans have unlimited wants and that this is good and natural. They don't use the word God-given anymore. Growth is then necessary to satisfy the unlimited wants economists themselves imagined and assumed in their models we have. In my book, I call for turning this circular logic on its head. We can and we have always limited our wants, I argue. Collective self-limitation has been the foundation of civilizations East and West, from Taoism and Buddhism to classical Greece. Want not, lack not. Only by limiting ourselves, the world becomes abundant, and we limit by sharing the commons in common. Fellow environmentalists have kept the question of limits alive, but we should own our choice of limits and stop attributing limits to a stingy nature. Unlike what Hollywood, with its myth of the Far West frontier, wants us to think, there isn't always a happy end. Without the limit of death, there wouldn't be life. Limits are not a constraint of freedom. Limits are a condition for freedom. To play music, a pianist needs a limited keyboard. An infinite keyboard just paralyzes. Now, more than ever, and in the face of planetary breakdown, we need what political philosophers have started calling limitarianism, setting limits on how much resources and fossil fuels we extract, how much wealth and income one can concentrate, how much inequality we can accept. Learning to live simply so that others may simply live.
All right, thank you. And sorry, I guess you didn't get the sound at the beginning, which defeats the purpose, but okay, sorry for that. So let me expand on the ideas that I presented in this 3-minute clip. I think the 3-minute clip was a little bit to introduce some of the concepts in a more visual way, and now I'm going to expand on them. So, okay. So in defense of limits is my presentation. So overcoming limits is a kind of a contemporary obsession, and it's everywhere. It's in the culture, and we see it. It is all around us. We are kind of saturated of claims like that. Beyond limits, when we go to the gym. Yesterday, a student of mine went to a Greek restaurant, and actually there was a logo there which was saying "Eat Greek food without limits," you know. And he sent it to me. He said, "Look, even here." But you can see it also in personal help and self-help books, quite popular with the Americans, not so much with the Spaniards, fortunately. But the whole culture of self-help and self-improvement without limit, overcoming your own limits, doing things as best as you can. There is a political also background to that, and it has been a quite strong, the idea of overcoming limits and of liberty and freedom as a fight against limits has been the basis of what has been called the neoliberal movement. Here, one of the political or intellectual fathers, not so much intellectual, I would say more political fathers of the movement, Ronald Reagan, saying famously, and this was written in response to the report of limits to growth. He said, there are no limits to growth because there are no limits of human intelligence, imagination, and wonder. So a framing of limits as something that comes from the environmentalist, and it's something that's sort of our fantasy. Our fantasy, we can always, with our intelligence, with our creativity, with our technology, we can always overcome limits. Of course, there are also some more shallow arguments about limits from someone like Bruce Lee, who also said there are no limits, probably no limits to how well you can play Kung Fu, no? Jokes aside, and I could go on for ages with quotes like that. There are also quotes in Spanish, El cielo no es el límite si hemos ido a la luna, or things like that. I was looking for them the other day. Jokes aside, though, on the one hand, our culture is obsessed with surpassing limits, but this is matched only by a mirror obsession. That is of the ultimate limit of our death, of our civilization death, not only our personal death, but also our death as a civilization. California's drought, the New York Times tells us, pushes the state of California against the limits of nature. You see like this kind of visual image. And of course, the IPCC and all the scientists are telling us that civilization is at stake if we don't act now and limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, which we are nowhere near doing that. But there is a fear, a constant fear of the ultimate catastrophe, of overcoming what now geoplanetary scientists call planetary boundaries, that we are overshooting these boundaries and then a collapse is gonna come. In my book and in the argument today in my presentation, I want to argue something that it's not so commonly seen in this way, that the ideas of limitless growth and natural limits are in fact two sides of the same coin. And I will argue that the idea of scarcity, that we don't have enough, that we live within a limited world, justifies an ideology of progress, which in fact produces, it's the one that produces scarcity. Okay, this might sound a little bit too abstract to you. I hope during the presentation it will become a little bit clearer. To escape this disastrous path of limitless growth, I argue, I want you to follow me in rethinking what limits, with a capital L here as a concept, as an idea, what they really are. What is it that we mean when we call for limits? Limits, I will argue, are not something which is out there. It's not the limit of our planet, the limit of something external to us. It is rather an internal barrier that we have to set on ourselves in order to live well, rather than an external barrier, something that confronts us and doesn't let us do things that otherwise we would like to do, like a constraint on our freedom. Limits, in other words, are a choice. We can choose to limit ourselves, or we might well choose not to limit ourselves, which is what we are doing now in terms of carbon emissions, first and foremost, and then live with the consequences of what we produce. Limits, therefore, I will argue, are not a constraint of freedom. Without limits, there is no freedom. So let me explain that. And as I said, this presentation is going to be, since it's a Christmas presentation, it's going to have a little bit of to get your appetite for the pizza, it's going to be a combination of conceptual scientific arguments and a little bit fables from movies and from culture. So I will start with a fable. And by fable, I mean a story from a movie. In the legend of 1900, the film's protagonist, whose name is 1900, was named for the year he was born. He was born in the eve of 1900. As a baby, he was found in a box on an ocean liner, on the bottom of the ocean liner doing transatlantic voyage. Played by Timothy Roth, 1900 never leaves the ship, and he develops inside the ship a gift for piano. Famous jazz pianists from all over the world come to the ship to duel with him, and he beats them all, who will gonna do the coolest solo. And he's always the one who excites the crowds the most. When a music producer asks him to come out of the boat to record an album, 1900 decides to finally leave the ship as an adult. He never stepped out of the ship before. In a memorable scene of the movie, he's halfway down the ladder and the crew is out on the top of the boat saluting goodbye. He stares at the city in front, New York, and he balks. He turns around, he looks back to the top of the ladder and decides to remain forever inside the ship. He never goes out of the ship. Many years later, 1900 hides in the ship's hold where he was born. The ship is about to be scuttled and sunk. It's many years after, and the boat is just going to be exploded and go to the bottom of the ocean. That's how they take care of boats, if you didn't know that, or at the time they were taking care of them this way. His friend Max knows that 1900 must be still on the boat and goes there to find him. And he begs him to leave the boat before it is sunk. And then 1900 gives a response of why he doesn't want to leave the boat and why didn't he leave it when he saw New York. All that city, he says, the city he saw New York in front of him, you just couldn't see an end to it. It wasn't what I saw that stopped me, Max. It was what I didn't see. In all that sprawling city, there was everything except an end. The keys of a piano, he says, because he was playing piano, remember, begin and the keys end. You know there are 88 of them. They are not infinite. You are infinite. On those keys, the music that you can make is infinite. But you get me up on that gangway and roll out a keyboard with millions of keys, and there's no end to them. That keyboard is infinite. But if that keyboard is infinite, there's no music you can play. 1900, in other words, limited himself because he wanted to. It wasn't the ship or the city that limited him. And this is what I call self-limitation. This concept of self-limitation was first proposed by a fellow Greek philosopher, Cornelius Castoriadis. Castoriadis has his own boat story. He left Greece in 1945 in this boat that you see here. It was a New Zealand ocean liner called Mataroa. And the French Institute in 1945 had chartered the ship to save left-wing Greek intellectuals during the civil war. So Castoriadis escaped to France. And in Paris, he had a very interesting career. He was the director of the unit in the OECD measuring economic growth. But at the same time, using a pseudonym, because he was a revolutionary, remember, that's why he escaped Greece, he founded a group called Socialism or Barbarism. Later on, he taught Greek philosophy, classics at the Sorbonne, while dabbling as a psychoanalyst. So here you see him on his psychoanalyst mode. So quite interdisciplinary too. And I don't know if he was a good analyst or not. The way he looks here, he looks like someone you could trust as your analyst. Now, what was the fundamental theoretical contribution of Castoriadis? The one he is most remembered for this book published by MIT Press, for example, The Imaginary Institution of Society. So Castoriadis distinguished, and this is a distinction that it's fundamental for my work and for how I understand this concept of self-limitation that I want to develop. Castoriadis distinguished between heteronomy and autonomy. If you are Greek, you understand easily what these words mean and where they come from, but I guess not many of you are Greeks. So let me explain. So heteronomous societies attribute their laws, their nomos that is, to an external force. Typically, it's the gods. Think of the 10 Commandments, no? The law, the 10 Commandments, came written on a plate from the outside. Society found them there, and it was the gods that gave it to them. That's heteronomy. Autonomous societies instead, Castoriadis argued, set their own limits and laws, and they're conscious and deliberate when doing so. For Castoriadis, the first autonomous society, although this can be disputed and debated, was the classical Athenian democracy, because it was the first democracy that didn't take the laws from the gods, and it questioned all truth. Laws, in that sense, were up for debate at change. They weren't written in any holy scriptures. Castoriadis argued that all societies make their own laws. So even the 10 Commandments, they didn't fall from the sky. Like the people at the time realized that these commands are necessary for co-living, no? But heteronomous societies attribute their laws to an external source that becomes indisputable and cannot be disputed, while autonomous societies are aware that they make their laws and they can always question them. So I'm Greek and I have passed a great part of my childhood daydreaming I was Achilles, a strong Achilles. I didn't know I would become an intellectual after and not so sporty as Achilles. So allow me here a short chauvinistic digression that I also have in my book. I have a whole chapter there on classical Greece, but I think it's important for illustrating a few of the concepts I want to talk about here. The very founding of the Athenian democracy that Castoriadis mentions was in fact an act of setting limits by Solon, the arch-legislator, which in Greek was called oros, the limit setter. He was the one who would set the limits. Solon, interestingly, in his biographically interestingly, limited himself too. Completing his legislative work in Athens, he was the first one to set the, might call it constitution of the democracy. He left Athens. He was self-exiled to avoid, he wrote, becoming too powerful without limits. No other ethic was more celebrated in Greek society than the art of limiting oneself, so-called phronesis in Greek or prudence in English. Unlike the moderns, for the Greeks, desire was not to be liberated from all limits, an idea to which I will go back to later on, but desire was to be crafted within limits. So to fulfill your desires, you have to understand your limits and express your desires within their limits. Anticipating the insights of modern psychoanalysis, the challenge for the Greeks was how to sort out your real from false desires. They elaborated rituals that dealt with death, the ultimate limit at the personal level. And they had tragedy as a form of art to remind them of the consequences of crossing limits. In their philosophy, the infinite was condemned, while the limit celebrated. And the cosmos, in their cosmology, was the creation of order, an act of limitation, out of an unlimited chaos. Why such obsession with limits, you might argue? You might argue, why am I obsessed also with limits? Maybe because I'm Greek, maybe because I'm environmentalist. We'll see what of the two. Maybe the two, the one compounds on the other. So in this very interesting book by Richard Seaford and Classicists, he explains how the Greek culture of limits was actually a reaction to the invention of money and its catastrophic potential to grow without limits. So the Greeks were the first to use money and to start giving loans with compound interest. What is compound growth interest? And this is actually why the society ended up with a very rich class of lenders and the majority of the society owing money to these lenders and becoming slaves. This led to civil war. And this is when Solon entered, and he said, we're going to sort this out by having some sort of democracy, no? Where the plebeians, the masses can also participate in decision-making. And then their whole art, their art, their tragedy, their philosophy, everything was a response to this problem, you know, like how can we stop this intangible substance, which is money, no, from expanding without limit and leading to disaster. The Enlightenment, Castoriadis reminds us, revived the Greek spirit of democracy. Democracy understood as self-limitation, as autonomy, as questioning any given truth, and of setting limits democratically. But this, Castoriadis interestingly argues, choked with the spirit of capitalism. So capitalism and democracy appear as two separate, for Castoriadis, projects of the Enlightenment. Because for capitalism, the pursuit of more and more money without limits, of more and more GDP, what we call economic growth without limits, is its spirit, and it is not to be questioned. So one cannot question now the desirability of having more and more money or more and more GDP and growth in a country. One cannot question the logic of having a market economy. These are not to be questioned, and Castoriadis argues this chokes with the idea of autonomy, which is we question our desires. For Castoriadis, the only ones today who keep alive this original promise of the Enlightenment, the promise of limiting ourselves, and arguing against all odds that we should limit ourselves, are environmentalists. So I'm an environmentalist, and the founding premise of environmentalism, since at least the 1972 book Limits to Growth by a team at the MIT, is that there are limits to growth. But do all environmentalists who invoke limits live up to Castoriadis standards? And how do they mean limits? So let me talk about that. Environmentalism, in my reading, has a mixed take on limits, both autonomous and heteronomous. On the one hand, there is, among more radical environmentalists, a strong desire to put limits to growth. In this tradition that I share, and I see myself as part of, we want to limit growth and bring it to an end, because growth, economic growth, without limit to infinity, is catastrophic, but also it's alienating. It's not the meaning of life there. By limiting ourselves and living simply, we leave space to others, human and not humans, forest animals, to simply live. And like the pianist, by limiting ourselves, we construct meaningful lives. So remember the pianist who says, in order to make music in the piano, I need a limited keyboard. I cannot go to this infinity and make some sense out of it. The ideal of a simple life within limits can be traced back to the Romantics in the Western culture, and from there to early Christians, Romans, and Greeks. But this spirit of simplicity has deep Eastern roots too, in Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, or Confucianism. So it's not only Western or Christian, clearly. Consider, for example, the figure of the turn of the century anarchist feminist Emma Goldman. Goldman advocated birth control, a sense of self-limitation, of women controlling their bodies and limiting how many children they want to have. She didn't argue this on the basis that the earth was scarce, but she argued that in order to enjoy sex and the pleasures that the earth abundantly shares with us, as depicted in the cover of her magazine here, women need to reclaim the control of their body and decide which are their limits. Goldman wanted birth control so that women can have the freedom to control their lives and their desires and enjoy their desires in this way. And of course, she had also a political outlook to that self-limitation, which was to stop producing dispensable people for imperial armies and cheap workers for the capitalist factories. On the other hand, in many environmentalist discourses today, including often mine, I have to accept, the desire for limits is mixed with a narrative of inevitability and of catastrophe. It is the finiteness of Earth in this narrative that poses an ultimate limit to us, a planetary boundary. This, I would argue, following Castoriadis, is actually a form of heteronomy. The planet here takes the place of the gods. It is Mother Nature that decides what the ultimate limit is, and not we ourselves. We can only obey this given limit put by the Earth on us. Unlike 1900, for whom the boat was a vessel of liberty, in ecologist Garrett Hardin's, someone influential in the argument about limits, and he wrote about a lifeboat ethic. According to which, we can think of the Earth as a shipwreck. Its country, Hardin wrote, is a lifeboat. And no matter how soft-hearted we may be, we do not have enough space to take castaways from other parts of the world inside our limited lifeboats. Our lifeboats are limited, and they will be sunk if we take more people in. And the only thing we can do is limit others out of them. And this is actually what is happening right now, the tragic story of the lifeboats being sunk without being helped in the name of protecting the borders of wealthy countries. Hardin was a so-called neo-Malthusian. Malthusians are those who follow the theories of Thomas Robert Malthus, a priest who became the world's first professional economist at the turn of the 19th century. Malthus gained fame with his essay on population, written in 1798. In it, Malthus argued that there is not enough for everyone to have a decent share. Poverty is an unfortunate but natural element of the human condition, he argued, since our desires are infinite and the earth is limited. Malthus's essay has an iconic status in debates about limits. In conventional wisdom, Malthus was someone who underestimated technology and its ability to produce wealth predicting overpopulation and famines. He was wrong then, and he is wrong now. You will often hear in pieces like that from the economists. Environmentalists like myself are then accused over and again for being Malthusians. We are those who want to condemn people to poverty, that our fantasy, as Ronald Reagan put it, is short, and that we cannot imagine the unlimited power of human intelligence to invent new technologies and overcome any seeming limits. We can mine the comets, and if the climate becomes unbearable, we can colonize the moon or Mars, we are told. And you see that there are people actually acting on these fantasies. I don't think it's a coincidence that in the moment that we understand that we are totally incapable, given the way the capitalist system works, to do something against climate change, that the fantasy of the wealthiest people on earth is how to escape and fly themselves, not have a collective project, no, but fly themselves and escape to the moon, no, or to Mars or wherever they want to escape. Let us understand a little bit this logic. What is this logic that talks of limits on the one hand and escape from the planet or from wherever on the other? In my book, I provide a new reading of Malthus, and I argue that Malthus was wrong, but not for the reasons that they are often given, not for the reasons that economists say that he didn't predict technology, etc. I show in my book how Malthus did not actually underestimate the possibilities of technology. What he actually postulated was that no matter how much technology develops, it will never be enough to satisfy our potentially infinite wants. And of course, infinity can never be satisfied, no matter what you do. Malthus was a cleric. He built his theory on a theological assumption that our duty as humans is to multiply and populate the earth. Our numbers can and should grow exponentially, he claimed. Birth control, protected sex, sex without having children, and other forms of self-limitation of our procreation that they were practiced actually at Malthus's time were unthinkable for him, because as a theologist, he said, no, we should have as many children as possible. He called them immoral. And God, he argued in his essay, made sure that if we were to follow these things, if we were to have birth control or sex without having children, we will suffer. Assuming a God-given nature to have as many children as possible, an infinite potential of the population, human population to expand, Malthus concluded that the world is and will always be scarce. And this idea of scarcity is central even to modern economics. Against scarcity, the only thing we can do, he wrote, is to work hard. Forget silly demands to help the poor or redistribute income, as the French revolutionary at his time were arguing. And we just have to put poor people to work to produce more and have growth that will satisfy a little bit more of these infinite needs. Malthus's essay was as much the work of an economist, an early economist, the first economist actually, as that of a cleric. His economic theory was the first built on the ad hoc assumption of a human nature bound to expand without limit and desiring to expand without limit. Economists to this day assume that our needs, our desires are infinite. So then the world is scarce by definition, a scarcity that can be confronted only by growth. The assumption that humans want without limit is used to vindicate expansion without limit. Expansion in turn is used as proof that humans want without limit. So yes, who wouldn't want economic growth, right? Growth promises everyone more tomorrow, but there will never be enough for everyone to have a decent share, as Malthus put it. This is a strange thing, because capitalists produce an immense amount of wealth. So what Malthus did, and economists do ever since that day, is to justify why amongst all this plenty and wealth that we keep producing more and more and more and more, there is never enough for everyone, why there are always poor. He argued that there is a fundamental law of scarcity in nature. Why would we care about that today? Why does all this matter today? Malthus's framing of limits is still with us, courtesy of economics, which I would call economics the religion of secular times. We take it for granted that our wants are unlimited, that the earth is limited and therefore scarce, and never sufficient for all our desires. And then the only thing we can do, you can see at the bottom of this graph, which is a graph from introductory economics, we can always have economic growth or then suffer by reducing our expectations. Limits in this way go go hand in hand with limitless gross domestic product and gross. The first time I encountered this logic was during my PhD, when I studied the role of water in the making of my city, Athens, the capital of Greece. What I found there was how the idea of limits, of the city not having enough water and having water scarcity, was mobilized over and again for the city to justify the expansion of its water system, colonizing the countryside with a series of dams. The last one was 300 kilometers away from the city, a huge dam, completely diverting a river from the countryside and bringing it to the city to allow it to develop and grow new suburbs. In the name of limits, then, the city's limitless growth was justified and pursued. Athens expanding from a town of a few thousand people at the turn of the 20th century to a megapolis of 5 million people, hosting half of Greece's population by the 1990s. My thesis here is that a heteronomous invocation of limits as something out there that limits us against our desire and wish, a natural inclination, can only lead to a fight against said limits. If the Earth is limited, we can only escape out of it. The autonomous version of limits that I and others espouse instead defends that our wants and our desires are not unlimited. Like the Greeks thought, they can be molded and they can be limited. As Donald Worster, an environmental historian, concluded in his magisterial book, Rivers of Empire, A History of Water and Growth in California, constructing, he wrote, an America of simplicity should start from a different relationship with water and nature, one of self-limitation, not as sacrifice, but as a different way of relating to our environments and different way of seeking pleasure and joy. The way we relate ourselves to our societies shapes the societies we produce. If only, as Worster wrote, we could sit in front of the desert and contemplate, instead of imagining how to turn it into casinos, lawns, and fountains. We are approaching the finale of our planetary hubris, and our myths and stories are failing us. Hubris, for the Greeks, was the transgression of previously undefined limits. That's very interesting. It wasn't the transgression of limits that you knew what there. It was an attitude that you were always willing to transgress whatever limits you would find, and then you would cross some limits that you didn't know they were there. The Greeks told stories of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun and his wings melted. They said stories of King Midas, who turning everything he touched into gold, died of hunger, or a more macabre story that it's not to be told to children of Erysichthon, who locked the sacred grove. He cut down the trees and he was condemned to eternal hunger, eating without limits, including his own flesh. I think I should go and tell that story to the Greek restaurant here in Barcelona, Dionysus, which has this motto, eat without limits. Now they should put this poster there instead. In our period, instead of reminding hubris, we are celebrating hubris. Consider this movie, Limitless. I don't advise you to watch it. I watched it in one of these boring nights that I was sitting in the couch of my father's house and it was playing on the TV. But when I saw it, I said, oh my God, this captures what I'm talking about in my work. This is a 2011 science fiction film starring Bradley Cooper. So Cooper plays a failed author who suffers from writer's block and he's abandoned by his girlfriend. Enter a new mind drug to save the day. So in a few hours, Cooper's character takes this drug and he completes a novel, which is an instant success that leads to more success and more success. And he gets his girlfriend back, etc. The catch, though, is that when you take this drug that he took and he became brilliant, you need more and more of it just to keep up. If you don't take it, you collapse and die. So he starts fighting to just get the drug from wherever. And that's like the nice things he does in the movies to get the drug. So I hail from a slightly older generation that I think like the games generation, video games generation that this kind of movies is directed to. And I was expecting like a kind of a nemesis, a hubris at the end, a road to salvation, like somehow he understands that what he's doing is wrong and he does right. But instead of dying or giving up the drug, Cooper in the movie secures an unlimited supply of it. So he learns to weather the side effects of the drug and he gets his girlfriend back and he raises up to become, at the end of the movie, a US senator, and the movie finishes with him running for president and probably winning the election. So hubris here and immorality are glorified. The addict hero walks over corpses to get his dose and cheats on his way to become the most powerful man in the country. If this sounds familiar, yes, it should be familiar because we've seen like the real part of that, which actually happened after the movie, but it's nice how movies capture like a gist of a moment and of a culture. So limitless is a myth apt, I think, for a civilization obsessed with overcoming limits at all costs. It prefigured the macho pathology of a new breed of rulers who take pride in their lack of moderation, who want to extract coal and oil or log the Amazon for the sake of doing so. Or if you remember this scene of Trump coming out of the hospital and just ripping the mask, you know, when he was just saved by an immense amount of resources and care put into him to just save his life, he still wanted to say that you can't limit him and ask him to put a mask. To be limitless is the dream of Elon Musk, who shoots a car up to the moon, aspiring to cross with his ego planetary boundaries. Conspiracy theorist here, but this photo always strikes me as weird because it seems like the car is going in the wrong direction, right? I don't know where the car is going, or it's going backwards towards moon. One fantasy right now is to escape. The other fantasy is to bury and protect themselves. So Silicon Valley billionaires are building bunkers, it seems, in New Zealand, and they want to store their brains in clouds to escape the coming apocalypse. Facing self-limitation and limits, our political and technological leaders' response is a hysteric, and I call it hysteric, rush to escape. The story I want to build instead is a story that has been with us since times immemorial. It is a story of a limited life as the good life, of a limited life as the just life in solidarity with those in need. Paradoxically, I argue in my book, when we treat the earth as abundant, it is only then that we can limit ourselves. Against this fantasy of capitalist civilization, Western civilization fantasy of a limited earth that we have to escape and fight against, we have to find some of the wisdom of hunter-gatherer societies, for example, who were limiting themselves by sharing and who, for them, the earth was abundant. Although in our standards, the conditions they were living were nothing but abundant. I'm not the only one who says this story. I'm saying it in my own terms of limits to growth or degrowth. But Pope Francis, for example, wrote a wonderful encyclical embodying the message, also himself, with an oath of poverty, living in a small apartment instead of the Vatican Palace. And it is not only the Pope who knows and embodies this common sense of living a simple life. Think of all those who practice a sober life, sharing the time and resources in solidarity with others in the church or the mosque, in their community garden or in their cooperative. The urban dwellers who contend with their work, family or friends and do not seek power and never higher salaries. The peasants who produce enough to feed their families, and countless others like this charming Greek grandmas here in an island yard. Now, we have to be aware that the ability to limit oneself and to limit one collective is a privilege. We live in a society that pushes us to pursue without limit, lest we fall into a condition of limits that they are not of our own choosing. The unemployed worker in the Rust Belt or the mother of 5 in sub-Saharan Africa cannot choose to limit themselves. Society, capitalist society, limits them. Self-limitation then is a privilege to fight for, a condition that we have to fight, that people can be able to choose. And granted also, limits are not always easy in practice. The thought of death and our own ultimate limit is unbearable. It is easier to shred our internal limits and react than reflect on, reshape, and embrace them. And each new generation wants to transgress the limits posed by its ancestors. Institutional or parental limits fuel the desire for transgression, right? The child, we see the basic human condition there is whatever you put as a limit, they want to transgress it. Of course, the development and the maturing of a child is when they learn that there are limits and how to behave within these limits. And I think a pathological condition is the condition, let's call it the Trump condition, although I'm not a psychoanalyst, so I don't want to invent a new term, but it's the Trump condition of an eternal kid, no? That wants everything and wants everything to be theirs without a limit. I have to argue also that once the genie of limitless expansion is out of the bottle, it's not easy to put it back in, because those who know no limits, the Trumps of the world, accumulate power and dominate, and violently, if need be, to those who choose to live within limits. So the enforcement of limits also can become a locus around which rulers amass power, invoking limits to keep the ruled in check. Think about, for example, of extreme or unnecessary pandemic-related limits that some government or rulers can use in order to control the population. So limits are problematic. I'm not saying that limits is an easy go, no. What I argue, and I want to insist in, that it is necessary to find new ways of establishing collective and fair limits while dismantling unjust ones. This is not easy, but against those pessimists who think that there is no alternative, because alternatives scare them, and they think that the only thing we can do is always try to escape and expand without limits, I remain optimistic that yes, we can limit ourselves, faced especially with the consequences of not doing so. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Giorgos, for this very interesting talk with a lot of ideas. And I think there will be many of us with questions and comments. Martin is right first, so let's start there.
I was just applauding. Sorry, Diego.
Ah, okay, yes. It is difficult to upload here in Zoom, but you should imagine this. It's like
I'm limiting to uploading without sound.
Okay. Estelle, is an applause too or not?
No, it's a question.
Okay.
If limits or if limiting yourself is an option is not given by a constraint, an outbound, then should we expand this theory to other things rather than economy and limit, for instance, our knowledge?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Castoriadis was dealing with that. So I think that there are two ways to see knowledge there. So I think one way to see knowledge is as knowledge that questions established truths, no, which is what I called as autonomy. So I think the knowledge that constantly questions what we take as established, like, you know, the Earth is round, or there is life outside of planet Earth, etc. I think that knowledge is good. Where Castoriadis argued knowledge becomes problematic is when there is more and more knowledge accumulated for the sake of knowledge and doing for the sake of doing. So this is what another French intellectual, Jacques Ellul, called the technological system. He argued that the basis of the technological system is that we should try to discover what can be discovered and do what can be done without necessarily a moral end to what we are doing. I'm thinking here of, I don't know if you read about it, but all these, how are they called, gain of function experiments that they took place. We now know about them because there is this theory that maybe the virus leaked from a lab, and then you read all these investigative reports of what sort of crazy experiments were going on, trying to see how humans could react to a potential virus that would look like corona. I mean, no one would ever know whether it escaped or not. That's not the point. But the point that these experiments without limitation, and people were arguing, you know, we should limit these kind of experiments. They're not necessarily a part if you're obsessed in the logic of the Americans of military domination, no? That you want to control the virus, that they don't come to you, or you can use them in a bioterror war. Anyways, but the idea that you have to do that because it can be done, and why not knowing also that? Why not knowing what would happen if a coronavirus would come? You know, let's try to create a coronavirus and test it. That this is problematic. The idea of discovering what can be discovered. Now, where do you set the limit? It's very problematic because the other extreme is to go back to search times and say, like, you can't research or investigate anything because it goes against the wish of God. No, I think somewhere in between is the tricky balance.
Any other comments or questions? Cerny, you're next. Estelle, if you can remove the hands, just to know that you are no longer, okay.
Okay, thank you for the talk. I think so we live in a multidimensional society, let's say, and we can set limits in any of the dimensions that we are here. And I think in our society, there are a lot of limits, but placed by the people who are limitless, just trying to put limits on the other people, but not on themselves. So I would like to ask if you have some idea on how this could be changed. So the powerful, limitless people imposing limits on the let's say standard people, how this could be changed, so to have a more autonomous society, as you said.
Yeah, it's a very good distinction you made. So I was the one I tried to make at the end, perhaps a little bit too fast, but there is a distinction between people putting limits on others so as to perpetuate their power or exercise their power, and the idea of self-limitation, that by self, you should, I don't mean just individual, perhaps the pianist example there helps, but I mean it as collective self-limitation. So we all limit ourselves in a common way, and it's not that the few limit the majority of us. No, it's that we all agree on limits. So I'm thinking there, for example, on the main limit that we need right now with climate change is to limit how much fossil fuels we take out of the earth. But that's a limit that it's not entertained. It's like all sort of programs and projects for developing renewable energies or doing that and hopefully stop getting fossil fuels out of the earth. But there's no concrete limit to say, like, you know, you have to stop getting fossil fuels by that amount by then, you know, it's just developing other things. Anyway, your question is very good. It's a political question, and it's not, of course, a question that I can answer in the abstract, but it's a question that has concerned radical scholars ever since. You know, it's like, how do we create a political and social movement that implements a radical democracy, a radical direct democracy? It's a democracy that's for everyone. It's not one that is controlled by the few, that they decide the limits for the rest, like a democracy that institutes itself. In my degrowth book, which is another book I have, which is a little bit more political economic, I say how this could happen, but all this is like wishful thinking, let's say, you know, like what could be political strategies or political dynamics that could lead to a radical change that change the balance of powers that in our times is getting more and more extreme. I think we live in a very similar situation to the one I described in classical Greece, which these situations end up with civil wars of one sort or the other, whereas there is an elite that accumulates more and more money just because it has the power to lend this money and get it back at a very high interest, while the rest gets less and less and gets indebted and enslaved in one way or the other by this rising inequality. So the only way is for the masses to revolt against that. And this happens, but we never know in what way it will happen and what form it will take.
Other comments?
Thank you.
Elena has a question. You are muted.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was very interesting. So unfortunately, I believe that this limit of growth is not a very popular thought. And my question is, did you see any change in trend with this being more acknowledged and more accepted in the society? And if not, what do you think we as individuals can do to convince the others that this is the right way to go?
There is a trend in the sense, I think, that which is a combination of the pandemic and climate change. I mean, the pandemic, it was a moment of realization that, you know, we can't do everything that we want, and that there is an interaction with an external world that has its own dynamic, and, you know, when scientists say, it's coming, and you have to decide how you adapt, how you interact, but it's not that you can go on as before and it won't happen, which is the denialism that was also there with, and it's still there with climate change. But we saw it now, and we saw it being repeated now, even with Omicron. Me, myself, I was like, okay, again, no, I don't think so, but it is here, and it is also a natural reaction to be a denialist. But I think with the pandemic, we realized the limits of this denialism. And I think it was a moment that a large part of the society has realized that climate change is following a parallel, but even more brutal dynamic. And if the scientists are saying that, the way we're going, it's going to be disastrous, that there must be something in it, So in that sense, at least from a part of the population that doesn't full-on fall on the denialist mode, because this happened also with the pandemic, and with climate change, we're going to see it more and more. There is a realization of the need to, in some way, limit ourselves and find a more reasonable relationship to Earth before breakdown, or breakdown has already started, but before breakdown takes full. So this realization is there, but I think the difficult part is the political part, and it's the part was the previous question. It's like, how do we act on that, and how do we act in a system that it's like so entrenched and so difficult to change, and can only do like marginal changes, like the ones that they agreed now on the climate agreements, that it's very difficult. So one hand, the difficulty is there. The other difficulty is the one you mentioned. How do you convince other people in a culture that it's so dominated and saturated by this imaginary of limitless expansion, because it's necessary for the system to reproduce itself. So if we don't constantly strive for more and more, or at least for more and more in order to stay to the same place, the system has a problem, right? And yeah, the how is, I think the how is by being aware, first of all, ourselves of that, by living the change we want to see happen, by telling these stories to others, and by organizing with others in alternative projects, from cooperatives to urban gardens to different ways of doing things, for different ways of interacting with our colleagues, from our everyday life to our political life, to the action and the things we organize politically. That's the vision we articulate in our follow-up book to the one I presented, which is called The Case for Degrowth. So we articulate their vision of changing ourselves, changing with others, and organizing politically to see this change generalized.
Thank you.
Any other question or comments? Let me perhaps play a bit of devil's advocate, because you are getting all questions and things actually that are in the same direction of your talk, no? But let's play a little bit the other situation in which, I mean, there are several things that you said on which I don't fully agree. For instance, I can say that the issues, or many of the issues that you presented, has to do with the cities. No? So the concept of city. So if you really need to seek a more, let's say, balanced distribution of the wellness and of food and of everything, one of the things we should probably have to rethink is this need we have to live all together, no? These 5 million people in the very central part of Greece, and then to have a lot of territory without any city similar to here. So the concept of city, I think, is very much related to what you were saying, no? Mm-hmm. And then coming back to the degrowth, to me, there are two things that perhaps I would like to ask you for a consideration. No? One is when do you think it is better to start to the degrowth? No, because degrowth applies in a very transversal way to everything, as Estelle was saying, even to knowledge. So at some point we may have started, let's say, 100 years ago to degrowth, and right now we would be dying on diseases that we can certainly cure very easily. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is that in order to decompress the cities, you actually need a lot of technology. And this is how we have, I mean, I'm not saying, of course, I'm not advocating that we are well done now, no? But if you look forward, we need a lot of technology in order to decompress how the population is distributed in the planet. So to me, these two things, perhaps you have thought a lot more than on this than what I am asking, and perhaps it is a good point for you to expand.
Thanks. The cities thing is complicated. So on the one hand, cities are much more consuming and they're colonizing a lot of space. They are importing things, and their main impact environmentally comes from the fact that people who move to cities typically tend to also to consume more in the cities. So there are places of rising income, etc. On the other hand, dense living of cities has certain environmental benefits, other factors equal. So if you say that the 5 million people of Athens, the exact way that they live in Athens were to spread in the territory and live the same way, that would be worse in terms of, you know, it would be much less economies of scale, much less efficiency, etc. So the question is, live in the countryside or decentralized? I fully much agree with you on decentralized modes, but they have to be also, like, let's say, lower energy use and resource use modes. So it can be the city living exported to the countryside. Technology has a big role to play. Technology has a big role to play in that. Obviously, technology has a role to play also in cleaning the energy supply, and very soon, in one way, we will have to confront also the fact that the climate will be damaged beyond repair, and then, you know, we will need technology to protect what can be protected. Or people are talking now about absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere. That seems very unlikely at the scale that it's necessary, but these things will have to be contemplated. So I'm not someone who will say we have to go against technology, but we have to realize that we are caught in a dynamic which is like technology to solve problems that technology has created, and that they move in ever bigger and bigger scale. Right now, the scale is the scale of the planet and the scale of climate breakdown, to which we have displaced the solving of other problems. So what I'm arguing is that this dynamic at some point has to stop, and it has to be a combination of technologies and of managing things, of improving our knowledge, but also scaling down, of retreating in certain ways. It cannot be like a constant confrontation and expansion. If you say when, I would say for high income countries, which I can define as the countries that are part of the OECD, I think the moment is now. Yes, 100 years ago probably would be the wrong moment to do it. And yes, by doing it now, probably we foreclose, I don't know, the next generation iPhones 50 years from now that we can't imagine, or I don't know what, like some kind of crazy technology that would let us communicate even faster and travel even faster. Although I doubt that we are at this moment. I think that was the moment 50, 60 years ago. Now we are at the moment that the heat, the backlash from the climate will be that hard that I start doubting that we will be able to have like also these changes in ways of living to the better that will be possible to be sustained. Or if they are sustained, they might be sustained for a very small elite, protected somewhere, etc. But I see it very difficult that we're going to have the generalized improvements of well-being that we've seen for the mass populations by keep growing and improving technology the way we've done up to now. So I think it's a very particular moment now to find the combination of retreat, of downscaling, and of exploring the possibilities that knowledge and technology gives us. So I'm not someone who should say stop all research now, stop developing all renewable energy, you know.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comment or question? If not, usually one would say, let's send the speaker again. We cannot really do it because we are in a Zoom, but we really and deeply thank you for the thoughtful presentation. It is a fresh it is for us a fresh presentation to have this kind of more.
No, I would like to ask. I'm sorry. I would like to ask too. Like, how is it for someone from doing space research to hear that to hear about limits? Because I understand that it can choke with something, which is like exploring the infinite, exploring without limits the infinite, right? So. And you saw that a lot of my imaginary is a little bit the planet Earth. The moment we stepped out and we saw that it was limited. So I wanted to hear a little bit from you. How does this relate?
I would not think personally that we never thought about this. I think me, for instance, I can say that I have thought several times on where we are and have read different books on where we are going into the right direction or not at the technological level. No? So I think it is something that is kind of common among the people doing science as well, no? At least at the basic research scientific world in which we move. So it doesn't sound completely, let's say, new. As I was saying, for instance, we have one of these off topics was on climate change. And we were discussing this from what was the real scientific evidence, how things are really, let's say, so at least in this institute, I think you have a very concerned audience. No, we may or may not agree on everything, but it is also the case that we are on a heteronomic scientific system. No, we are constantly limited by our grants application all the time. So it's not, we certainly are not in a limitless growth, no? From that point of view. I don't know if someone else would like to answer. I think this is more a question for everybody, no? So it's maybe.
No, I think it's time for pizza. No worries.
No, yes, I'm seeing in the chat that some people agree. But
yeah, let's go for pizza. You go for pizza. I can't come, but thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Have a very good year, and let's keep in touch. Maybe to see further progress on the matters. And you are very much welcome to visit us sometime since you are close. And
okay, I'll let you know. We can have lunch or something
in person. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Have a nice
for the people here, we go down now to the inner garden to have a cocktail. So thank you, Giorgos.
Thank you.